if the child is not in crisis, then you can think of using calcium channel blockers and beta blockers. Diuretics doesn't have much role in controlling blood pressure. So, but if it is fluid overload, you can always think of giving a couple of days some of the diuretics. So as I earlier mentioned, we don't use ACE inhibitors. Always discuss with renal team as well as the cardiac team if you are in doubt of any cause or any reason why you need to start medication. Now, coming to the outcomes of the babies who have neonatal hypertension, it all depends on the underlying etiology. If it is because of EAC insertion and it's because of thromboembolism, and usually this should resolve over time and these babies shouldn't have any problem. If it is because of renal parenchymal disease, these babies can have long-term hypertension, and these are the babies which needs to be continuously monitored, and you need to see these babies in your OPD follow-ups. If prolonged hypertension can develop, and in case if it develops for a long time, then you need to make sure that the cardiovascular examination is carried out, and especially these babies can also lead into stroke as well as chronic kidney disease later on. If your child has a BPD, make sure that in your follow-up, the blood pressures are checked quite regularly, because it's been known that babies who have been on long-term ICU and have chronic lung disease, oxygen dependent, we would have used a lot of medications. They are IUGR, and these babies can have long-term hypertension, so you need to monitor them. And of course, if there is any repair of renal artery stenosis or coarctation of aorta, surgical correction, they can have restenosis, and don't think that that is not the cause for hypertension. It's important to follow up these babies to some certain extent to make sure that they are not getting back those hypertension what they had before. So to conclude my talk, it's usually, hypertension in neonates is secondary to the underlying etiology, and most of them get better. A detailed history and a meticulous examination, a systematic approach and investigation has to be carried out for all babies. While most neonates with hypertension may not require drug therapy, outcome is mainly dependent on the underlying etiology, and in general, they do better. Medication is, in most of the case, eventually can be weaned off. However, the long-term effect on cardiovascular should be looked into it, and we don't have much data on that in an extremely smaller babies. A large prospective study has to be done in terms of establishing a robust data about what is the blood pressure at different age, gestational age group and at different post-conceptional age group based on the sex and as well as the weight. And there should be further studies to see the safety and efficacy of hypertensive drugs on these small babies. With this, I would like to conclude my talk. And I think I have finished in time, a couple of minutes before. I would leave to my moderator if he has anything to say about it. Hello?
Thank you, Prakash Garu, for completing your talk in stipulated time of 20 minutes. And it's a very difficult topic and difficult to follow in level 1, level 2 care hospitals. But definitely it is useful talk for all the practicing pediatricians and especially neonatologists. And especially babies who are on umbilical catheterization should be followed closely for the development of hypertension in future, and as well for the renal complications also. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your nice talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao, for your time as well as putting your thoughts and inputs.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Over to Newcon admin.
my favorite legend of all, Professor Alan Job. And he has been working with Professor Alan Job all this while for the last 20 years. So that I do not think you need any more introduction about Professor Vivek Narendran. He is one of the speakers we all love to hear him. We have heard him in our Indian forums for some time. Fortunately, we have him physically here with us today. That's a big honor, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Like his interests are specific interests where he's doing original research is in neonatal dermatology, skin. Something, a field in neonatal skin, something we really don't, give any thought or we don't know anything about, I would say. But then he is also an excellent speaker. We have heard him so much on ventilation. This is a respiratory symposium we're going to have today. So, and the topic is something, again, an upcoming topic where we have heard so many new research coming. It's on the inhalation therapy of budesonide and surfactant. So, over to Dr. Vivek Narendran.
Thank you, Manoj. Can you all hear me? So, thank you, Manoj. That was a very nice introduction. So, today, I thank the organizers first, and it's an added privilege for me to come to Bangalore because it's my hometown and then to talk at NNF. So the topic today is this combination of budesonide and surfactant a good strategy to reduce BPD? By the end of my talk, I hope to tell you that this is probably the most effective strategy to prevent BPD based on current data. So just this is an obligatory background slide that all of you know that prematurity is a leading cause of neonatal deaths. Preterm births happen about 10 to 12%, depending on where you are. And they are definitely a cause of increased mortality and morbidity. Now, coming to today's talk, this is the group of babies that we are interested in. These are extremely low birth weight babies, less than 1,000 grams. And the reason we are interested is because they are prone to develop BPD. I'm not interested in a 32-weeker who gets surfactant. So these are the babies who get BPD. And in any study anywhere, roughly 2/3 of these small babies get BPD. And whenever we look at BPD, we also look at death and BPD together because they're competing outcomes. That means if the babies die, obviously there'll be less BPD. So you always want to look them together. And the reason BPD is important is because they have the worst cognitive outcomes and pulmonary outcomes. If there is a predictor of bad cognitive outcome, one of the strongest is BPD. So today we have all these interventions that you have heard about in other talks. These are strategies that have been evidence-based: delivery room CPAP, vitamin A, caffeine, postnatal steroids. But this strategy that I'm going to talk to you is new and is way, way better in terms of efficacy. So let's look at budesonide and surfactant. So budesonide is a steroid and surfactant is surfactant to reduce your tension in the premature lung. So when I say a combination of budesonide and surfactant, I'm actually talking about prophylactic surfactant and prophylactic intrapulmonary steroids. This is very important. So when you start combining it and giving it to high-risk infants on day one, what I'm doing is I'm giving prophylactic surfactant and prophylactic steroids to prevent BPD. So let me look at the evidence for these two separately, and then I'll combine them and show you the evidence. So let's look at prophylactic surfactant versus selective surfactant. So this is old studies when we used to intubate babies for RDS. And when one group used to give surfactant as early as possible, and the other group, we used to wait for some pre-specified criteria, an oxygen over 30% or whatever, or CO2 greater than 65. So that was called selective surfactant administration. So all the evidence for prophylactic surfactant shows that it clearly reduces air leak and reduces mortality. Okay, that is prophylactic surfactant. However, today's practice is different. Today we give antenatal steroids, we do early delivery room CPAP, and then we do selective surfactant administration. Once we do this, that first line does not hold true at all now, because just early CPAP and surfactant can reduce BPD and death. The point I want to make here is surfactant and BPD, the CPAP and selective surfactant reducing BPD, individually there were 3 big trials. For example, support trial, COIN trial, and the Vermont Oxford trial. Each of them by themselves didn't show that BPD and death reduces. Only when you put them all together and do a meta-analysis did it show that the risk of BPD and death was reduced. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not a big, a big effect. So it's a much smaller effect, but it does reduce BPD and death. So prophylactic surfactant is no longer recommended. What about prophylactic steroids? So when I talk about prophylactic steroids, I'm talking about inhaled steroids. So intrapulmonary steroids. The reason we are interested is it acts quicker, it acts locally, lower dose, safer drug. But the problem with that is getting the drug to where it should act. So unless the particle size is less than 2 microns, you can't get that drug to the distal airways. So it's usually not effective. With the current way of delivering these medications, the current nebulizers, MDIs, can get in just 1 to 2% of the dose delivered to the distal airways. So it's not an effective therapy. But let's say you do it, you start doing it from day one because it's prophylactic steroids I'm talking about. The largest trial is by Bastler. You can't see the reference because that thing is hiding it there. But that was published about 6 years ago in New England Journal of Medicine. What it showed was, yes, inhaled steroids, early inhaled steroids, meaning prophylactic steroids, works. But then there was a concerning trend for increased mortality. Though the BPD and death came down, there was increased mortality, which was unexplained. The other concerning thing whenever you give steroids is that it might get absorbed into the systemic circulation and affect the developing brain and lead to poor neurocognitive outcomes. So that did not happen in this study. So that is very reassuring. But there was this trend for increased mortality. So as of today, we do not recommend prophylactic inhaled corticosteroids for at-risk babies. So let me talk about, to close the loop, since you'll all want to know what about prophylactic systemic steroids. Okay, this is not the topic of discussion today, but I just want to give you that information. We use different kinds of steroids because pulmonary inflammation is critical to developing BPD. So steroid being anti-inflammatory, we want to use that, and dexamethasone is commonly used. And if you use it early, that means prophylactic, within the first 7 days, it works, but then it has increased side effects. There's increased GI perforation, increased incidence CP, and worse outcomes, neurodevelopment, as well as CP. I mean, death and CP as well. So as of today, we don't do that. What about hydrocortisone? In hydrocortisone, there is one large trial, though I've stated 5 RCTs. One of them is the largest, known as the Premiloc, which was done in France. What did it show? They also started day 1. So it's systemic, day 1 hydrocortisone. It works. It reduces BPD and death. That's what it means, increased survival without BPD. And overall, it seems to be effective, and it has increased risk for GI only when you give it along with endomethacin. And there's a slight increase in late onset sepsis, but overall it works. However, there are 2 other trials that have just been published. I mean, they are not yet published, but just completed. These are also hydrocortisone trials. One is a late hydrocortisone trial. These are called Stop BPD in Amsterdam, a Dutch study. They started on 7 to 14 days, not early, not less than 7 days. And then we finished a big trial called the NICHD Neonatal Network trial. We gave it between 14 to 28 days. Both were babies who were on mechanically ventilated, and we were given steroids to prevent BPD. Both of them, no difference in the primary outcome of BPD or death. Again, saying late hydrocortisone does not work. Early dexamethasone does not work. Early hydrocortisone, there is an initial signal that it might work, only 1 study so far. So at this point, we don't use this. So far, I've convinced you that no longer is prophylactic surfactant used. I've told you that prophylactic inhaled steroids is not used, and also showing you that this prophylactic or early systemic steroids are also not used. But I'm talking about a combination of these 2, prophylactic steroids and prophylactic surfactant. So why then? Why are we doing this? The reason is, I told you, when you do just inhaled corticosteroids, the steroids doesn't go into the distal airways. It stops somewhere in the large airways. So what budesonide does, it acts as a vehicle. It drags it down and pushes it down to the distal airways. That's the reason for combining these two in addition to the anti-inflammatory effects of budesonide. So let's look at some initial animal studies. I won't go into the details. In small animals like mice and rabbits, it works. It decreases inflammation, improves gas exchange, and the lung histology is also improved. In larger mechanically ventilated lambs, again, it works. There is anti-inflammation. The pro-inflammatory cytokines are less. And the interesting part is just not less in the lungs, also less in the liver and in the brain, suggesting that it has systemic anti-inflammatory effects. So that again may suggest that you might have beneficial effects on the brain as well. And then whenever you combine two drugs, you're always wondering if one destroys the other. So in this case, both the structure and function of both these drugs were maintained. So that was very important. So let's look at some human studies. The first study was published in 2008, very small study. I'm talking 2008 is almost 12, 13 years ago. 116 babies, sick babies on mechanical ventilation. They decided to give surfactant and budesonide. The dose of budesonide is 0.25 milligrams per kilo. When you give inhaled steroids, you give almost 25 times this dose, higher dose. So the Bachelor study I was telling you about in New England Journal of Medicine, inhaled corticosteroids, you're giving 25 times more. So this is a very small dose, 0.25 milligrams per kilo. And you did that. And this difference, 60 to 30, is unheard of in clinical trials. Unheard of if anybody is doing clinical trials. So there's a 50% reduction. So nobody sort of believed it. And this strategy was dormant for about another 8 years. And then he published, the same guy did a multi-center trial. It was just in his center. Then he did a multi-center trial, US, China, and Taiwan. And then he had 265 babies, which is pretty big babies. I mean, big number. And again, severe RDS on mechanical ventilation. And he showed, again, BPD death significantly improved, right? 42, 66%. These are all huge differences. Normally you get 3-4% differences. These are huge differences. And the severity of BPD, there are different ways of classifying BPD. And he shows that the severity was also less. So these are the only two randomized controlled trials done so far. But there is one retrospective study actually done by my fellow. So he started going and doing in his unit now, after he finished his fellowship, he started doing this intervention. And then he's got now about 400 to 500 babies. So he did the same thing, surfactant, budesonide, and for babies who failed CPAP, because we are all believers in early delivery room CPAP. So if they failed CPAP, they needed intubation. He did intubation with budesonide. And then his primary outcome didn't change when you look at just BPD and death. But then severity of BPD, there are two different ways he defines it, and they were less. So it's still working. So, I mean, this is the new thing to do. Anytime you have randomized controlled trials, you try and put them together. So when you do a meta-analysis, you see a 43% reduction in the risk of BPD. And then the more important outcome, combined outcome of death or BPD, is reduced by 40%. 40% reduction is huge. So if you look at number required to treat is only 3. So to give you an example, early delivery room CPAP and surfactant, the number needed to treat is about 16 to 17. Then, for example, I showed you the Primilock study, early hydrocortisone, the number needed to treat is 13. So anything, vitamin A is huge, so it's a very marginal. So sometimes we debate about its efficacy. So to have a number, just to put it in the right context, number needed to treat of 3 it's really, really unheard of in neonatology for an intervention study. But the concern, like any other, whenever you give steroids, is what about the side effects? So here I'm trying to say the short-term side effects are usually hyperglycemia, hypertension, and so the risk of sepsis. But the one thing that we have seen in the babies that I have used it, it's mainly the hyperglycemia, and I have just one baby so far that I had to use insulin to control the hyperglycemia. So we believe about 4% of the drug is absorbed, whatever 4% of the total dose you give intratracheally. That's hardly anything. That's the kind of plasma level of steroid you get after you give antenatal steroids. So if antenatal steroids you think is safe, this is relatively safe. And the peak level is around 30 minutes of budesonide, and its metabolite is at 2 hours, and its half-life is only about 4 hours. So the concern, again, the biggest concern is, will it affect neurodevelopment? So, and if you look at the two studies, that the big, large study that he did in 2016 in Taiwan, actually there were favorable trends towards improved neurodevelopment. And then in this retrospective study that I told you that my fellow did, and he is safe, that there is no concern of systemic absorption and causing poor neurodevelopmental outcome. So there are two clinical trials now ongoing. They're called, these are the two big trials. I guess Arvind wanted me to speak on this because I'm one of the PIs for that first trial. So we are trying to my center, it's a multi-center trial. We have 16 centers. Can you imagine, we are ambitious goal of enrolling 1,160 babies less than 1,000 grams. So we have that, and instead of surfactant, we're going to, Survanta, we're going to use Curacor. That means porcine versus bovine. And there's a similar trial in Australia going on now called the PLUS trial, exactly the same design. And they are also pretty ambitious. They want about 1,060. And I think they've already enrolled close to 300 babies there. And we are just starting, we're about 50 to 60. So the reason I'm introducing you to those two is that once those results come, I'm hoping this might become a standard of care. Every time you give surfactant, you might give a little bit of this steroid for small babies. We'll keep our fingers crossed. So this is the hypothesis. You look at the PCOT in extremely preterm, the question we are asking, in extremely preterm infants, early intratracheal administration of a combination of budesonide with surfactant, that's the intervention, compared to just surfactant alone, the control arm would reduce the incidence of physiological BPD or death by 36 weeks to, post-menstrual age. That is how we define BPD. That is any oxygen requirement at 36 corrected gestational age. So this is just to tell you, this is the primary outcome. Like I told you, nothing different. Again, interested in BPD and death. But the secondary outcome, which we are really focusing on, is the neurodevelopmental outcome, because we want to make sure that it is safe. I think we strongly believe that it is efficacious, but we want to make sure it is safe. So for those of you who are wine lovers in the audience, the way the budesonide drags, the surfactant drags the budesonide down is known as the Morangani effect. So Morangani effect is, today in the banquet, when you get a glass of wine, I want you to take the glass of wine and swirl it, and you'll see we call it legs. The parts of alcohol will go up and then slowly go down the sides. I want you to see it today, and for wine drinkers, it's called the legs, wine legs. Basically, if you have more wine legs, it means there's more alcohol in it. So what it does is, when you swirl, part of the alcohol, wine is essentially alcohol and water. So the alcohol evaporates as you twirl, and then the water in it has a higher surface tension. It pulls the alcohol up. So what's happening here is the alcohol goes up, and then it goes up to level, and then after a while, gravity takes over and falls. So today I want you to try this, and that's exactly how the surfactant pulls the budesonide down. Okay, and that's called the Marangoni effect, and you can check it today. So this, and thank you, and this is, brings back memories. This is my hospital where I train. So this is Victoria Hospital, part of Bangalore Medical College. This was built over 120 years ago. I'm still very proud of it. Looks magnificent. And so I drove around just to see this today. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Vivek. It was such a wonderful talk. Now the session is open for discussion.
Questions from the audience?
In the meantime, can I ask you one thing, sir? You were talking about the Professor Yes. He was the only one. Ye was the only one who convinced by the clinical trial. What could have been the reason why the other study could not replicate the same result?
Nobody has done it.
It is a retrospective one.
Yeah, just a retrospective one. That retrospective group did animal studies. So they were pretty confident that it's efficacious, and they were bold. Most people can't pull this off in America. In America, if you have to do it, you need to have strong evidence, safety data, and all that. but he just somehow convinced his, it's called institutional review board, like the ethics committee, and he started doing it because he had done it in the labs, and he started doing. None of us can do it right now without evidence.
Did he look at, because the previous concern was regarding the increase in late onset sepsis also. So
No.
did he look at the
He-
incidence?
In his thing, he has had no side effects of even hyperglycemia, hypertension, sepsis, no difference.
But no long term.
No long term. So the most important concern is long term, because anytime you give steroids, and everything that we know was related to steroids and CP, right? Every time we tried to cure CP, cure BPD, we ended up with poor neurodevelopmental outcome and CP. So anytime people say steroid, we are worried what will happen to the head.
Interesting, very interesting study. Probably this is the way things will shape up. Any questions? Please give him a mic.
It's a beautiful talk.
Thank you.
And suddenly something new which is coming into the shape. See, Indian scenario, you see millions of babies, and some of the Indian people or bigger institutes can take up such types of projects, can get enrolled with the scientific committee and can do this sort of work.
Yes.
We should write to NNF to do such sort of work because we have got the data available with us.
So he's talking about extreme preterm babies only.
These are small babies, less than
Yes,
1,000
same thing.
grams.
We have got centers catering
Correct,
hundreds of extremely low birth weight babies, which are under the government medical colleges also and in private institutes also. If they take up with the national database and take a scientific approval, I think such studies can be conducted under your guidance in India also.
Yep, it's very true.
This is my request to the NNA people that they should.
Yes,
take
sir,
up
I will
like
pass
this.
on the message,
Because
sir.
it gives, see what he said, it is not 4 and 5% difference. It is 50 or
It is really interesting, sir. And if it is interesting, if India can become part of this historic study in the future, like, and then if you can organize a NICHD funded multi-centric trial with national trial with India as a thing, it would be really wonderful. So if you can do
No,
that.
but you can do it yourself. It is a relatively cheap drug.
Yes.
Budesonide is very cheap. Surfactant, you already have different kinds.
In 1990 conference, I'll tell you, when somebody asked Dr. Meherban Singh, then that time the less than 1,000 grams babies, it was a big discussion that whether we should survive. Then he told that time, if you start surviving 700, 800 grams babies in your NICU, your 1,000, 1,200 grams baby will automatically survive.
Yes.
Very true, sir. Very
if
true.
we concentrate on this sector, our other babies, which are of little higher age group, they will automatically start surviving. Our NMR will go down like anything.
So just to sum up, this curing BPD, we have so many talks on BPD. Caffeine is a talk by itself, postnatal steroids, vitamin A. This is like, in 1930s when we were treating sepsis. We didn't know much, but things have changed. Now we know what antibiotics, what bacteria. 1950s, 60s, we didn't know what leukemia was, but now today we cure leukemia in children. We are still in that stage that comes to BPD. We are still throwing different things. There's a lot more to learn. This has the potential to make a big dent in BPD.
There is good scope.
Yes, sir. I will definitely convey this message with all the inputs he has given today by his illustrious talk to the NNF. We will discuss in the NNF also.
Thank you.
Yes.
Congratulations, sir, for such an excellent talk. I am Dr. Ravindra Gupta from Bhopal, Itarsi. Sir, first of all, I want to ask that there are two kind of modes available. One for budesonide especially. One is by nebulization therapy, another one is inhaler. So which mode we should use? First of all, I want to ask you. And as I have understood so far, that first we should use budesonide, thereafter we should use Survanta, or what should be the time limit, what should be the time guideline between these two?
So first of all, don't start using it till one of these large 2 trials come out. And all the steroids that we're using now are inhaled steroids. We use an MDI, right, or a nebulizer. The current nebulizer, I told you, you can't get the drug to where it goes. So this is the same budesonide that you use for nebulization. It's a liquid. So you mix it with your surfactant. So if you're using Survanta, it is about 4 ml per kilo. And then you add this 0.25 milligrams in the same syringe. You mix it and give it together. So it's the same liquid that you nebulize for inhaled steroid. It's no different.
To just add to his question, can I ask the method of administration that you're planning in your BIP study?
It's the same thing. Just like we give surfactant, it's only thing is it's blinded.
Ensure, Lisa, or
Good point. So this is only the traditional way of surfactant administration. So no Lisa, no Ensure, but that will be the next step. If somebody wants to do something different, is just because we're now doing early CPAP, Lisa, whatever, minimally invasive steroid, whatever, however you want to do, whether it's
so that again reduces the number of babies. Only the
Yes.
ventilated babies you would use.
yes.
Isn't it, sir?
So it's
Okay,
much
thank you.
harder for you to do it if you're going to do early CPAP and Lisa. But for us to get the FDA approval to show that this
Probably with a
study-
multicentric pattern, we should be able to, NNF should be able to do if NNF is this thing probably.
No, you should do with Lisa. You should do the same thing with Lisa, not,
Lisa.
yeah, you can do the same thing with Lisa.
Yes, we, yeah.
Or even with laryngeal mask. Now for bigger babies, laryngeal mask has been shown to be very effective.
So myself, Dr. Milind Mandlik, there were studies done on surfactant plus budesonide in meconium aspiration. Your comments, please.
No, there's two different things. We never gave it as a combination. We gave surfactant for meconium aspiration because meconium goes and inactivates the active ingredient of surfactant called surfactant proteins. So you give surfactant because your whatever endogenous surfactant is no longer active. Steroids is a little later. The steroids is still debatable whether you should give it for acute meconium aspiration. We never gave a mixture like this. No.
Any other questions? So I would again like
Thank
to
you.
express our gratitude, Professor Vivek. It was actually one of the talks which had occupied the peak time because looking at the novelty and hearing all the talks, I think this is the only, I would say only talk, the one of the talks, one of the best talks. So thank you so much, sir, for delivering this. It's a pleasure and it's an honor for us to have you fly down from Cincinnati to here to deliver this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for spreading the light on the use of budesonide on bronchopulmonary dysplasia. So I would like to request Dr. Manoj, sir, to present the certificate to Dr. Vivek Manindra, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. So we'll go to our last talk of the day. Volume targeted ventilation in preterm infants with RDS. I'd like to introduce our chairperson, Dr. Milind Mandik. He's the director of Color Children Hospital and the president of NNF Nagpur. And he'll be organizing the next Neocon in 2023. He'll be the chairperson. I would like sir to introduce our next speaker. Sir, Pradeep sir, I'm audible?
Yeah. Can I hear me?
Yes, sir, 1 minute.
Thank you, NNF Bangalore, to give me this opportunity to chair this session. Today, our speaker, he has done DM from Jipmer, PGI Chandigarh. He is currently working as professor and neonatologist at Ramaiah Medical College, Bangalore since 2006. His areas of interest are neonatal ventilation and neonatal nursing training. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Chairperson. Can I share the screen from here?
Yes, sir.
Just stop there. I can share my screen.
Yes, sir, you can share the screen now.
Yeah. So I'm audible. My screen is visible there.
Yes, sir, it's audible and clear.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you, National Neocon. Thank you, Karnataka State NNF, for inviting me to speak on this very important topic, volume targeted ventilation Now, this term might look little, I'm going to go a little broad on this terminology, but I'm not sticking to one particular mode because it's called by different names in different ventilator. But in principle, they are all talking about volume targeted ventilation. 20 minutes is too short a time to talk on any important topic on ventilation. But what I'm going to quickly go on about is what is volume targeting, what is the evidence that is available, and why probably we are not still using it as we should be using it so much as we had expected it to be, and how do we use very practical tips. So probably I'm going to go sort of overview and not go into very practical aspects about using volume guaranteed ventilation. Now, I think when we started ventilation, we were very, very clear. Our primary goal of mechanical ventilation was maintenance of adequate gas exchange. Now, when we probably when we were postgraduates, our main aim was to get the gas exchange, get the baby to survive at whatever cost. At that point, I think our only point of interest was I need to have adequate gas exchange. I need to have a normal blood gas was our goal when we were ventilating. But now I think over a period of time, we have started to understand that ventilation does cause lot of lung injury. And now we say, no, it's not enough we ventilate. We say it's important to achieve this target with the least possible degree of hemodynamic impairment, lung injury, and brain injury. I think this is the point which is making us to see what new we can do on mechanical ventilation, because the conventional ventilator, I think we did a lot of, I wouldn't say damage, but we did end up having a lot of injury onto the lungs. We had bad injuries in the brain. We had ROPs coming up drastically because of our probably inadequate or inappropriate use of the ventilator. So I think now we are moving towards how can we achieve an adequate gas exchange with a very minimal degree of brain and lung injury. So in that process, we are trying to innovate our ventilator modes again and again. What we were conventionally been doing for last probably 2-3 decades is pressure limited ventilation, which was delivering a fixed peak inflating pressure. And that is what we've been using for last 2-3 decades. And I think somewhere we were very comfortable and we had that sense of belonging that I am the one who's controlling the pressure onto the baby, so I can be very sure the baby will not end up with barotrauma. So we were sort of very proud in saying that I'm controlling the pressures, but then we realized that it is not the barotrauma, it's not the pressure, it is at the end of the day, the volume, the tidal volume that this pressure is creating, that is the one which is adding to the injury. And this is not in your control when you're doing a pressure limited ventilation, where you're giving a fixed pressure. What tells you or what the tidal volume the baby achieves is purely dependent on the pressure that you set and the lung compliance. So here is a big mismatch, because at a given point of time, we do not know what is the pressure that particular lung needs. So I think we realized this of late that it is not the barotrauma, it's a volutrauma. And then people started using volume controlled ventilation. Volume controlled ventilation, what we use in adult is not been new. They did try in newborns, but the conventional volume controlled ventilator were not optimized for use in neonates. The tidal volume were lost in the gas compression in the circuits. The microprocessor were not very, very sensitive. They were measuring the delivered tidal volume, so there was no idea. There was a lot of the leak compensation was not taken into account. So the proper volume control ventilation did not work very well in neonates, and people gave up on that, saying that no, volume control doesn't work in NICU. Then people said, see, pressure we know works very well, but we have a problem there. Volume control is not being used. I mean, it's not been devised or appropriately devised for use in NICU. So what can we do? The volume target ventilation is nothing but a microprocessor based modification of pressure limited time cycle ventilator with the ability to deliver a more consistent tidal volume. So here we have taken the best of the two. We have said, yes, we know pressure limit works very well, which is time cycle ventilator works very well. Then we said we also need to target the tidal volume, but the conventional volume control is not working. So we sort of merged both the technology, and we said, let's have a hybrid mode, which takes the best of, or it sort of mixes up your pressure control with a option to set or achieve a set tidal volume, thereby avoiding a tidal volume which can be too high or too low for that baby. So in simple word, what we exactly do here is, in a volume targeted ventilation, we set a pressure limit. We don't set the pressure, but we set a limit saying that, see, you are okay. I give you autonomy to decide the pressures, but you can't go beyond this particular point. So that's what you are determining in a volume targeted ventilation. So you're not directly setting the pressure, but you're setting a limit beyond which you don't want the ventilator to go. So you have some kind of a control that, yes, I'm very sure this ventilator will not go beyond 30 or 32 of PIP. But we give the machine an autonomy to work on the working pressure. So what it does is, this is a flow, this is a tidal volume. So what it does is, it measures the previous breath tidal volume. Let's say this was the tidal volume. It measures, and then it decides how much is the pressure that should be given for the next breath. So it is like taking the previous breath, the exhaled tidal volume, and it is deciding that, yes, this is the pressure that you need to give. If the tidal volume delivered is low, then the pressure goes up. If the tidal volume delivered is high, the pressure comes down. So what the machine does is, it measures the previous breath and decides about the pressure on the next ventilator. It's not exactly real time, but it does sort of in real time, but it takes the previous breath tidal volume into the count to decide the next pressure. So over a period of time, you sort of have a very stable tidal volume that you want the baby to achieve. So this is sort of in principle where you are setting a pressure limit, you are measuring the tidal volume, and the machine is deciding the pressure on subsequent breaths. That's in a nutshell about volume targeted ventilation. Now, if somebody asks you, why should I target volume? I was very happy doing targeting pressure. Why suddenly we are targeting volume? As I told you earlier, volutrauma is bad and not the barotrauma. We found the villain there is not the baro, it is the volutrauma which was creating the lung injury. So we need to ensure that we are giving adequate tidal volume. But also important, when we don't understand is, when we are ventilating, we are very aggressive. We tend to end up giving more pressures, end up creating more hypocapnias. Now, one of the major worries when we have hypocapnia is hypocapnia-induced brain injury. The hypocapnia causes cerebral hypoperfusion, leading on to brain injury, so and so that even a single episode of hypocapnia below 20 has been found to be an independent risk factor for periventricular leukomalacia. And they have also found that there is a dose-dependent effect. That means more number of hypocapnias during the ventilator, more is the brain injury. So what we are not realizing is the lung injury is one major concern. But what we are also not realizing is we are probably going to create hypocapnias, which could be bad for the baby's brain. So I think when I'm targeting volume, I'm not only protecting the brain, not only protecting the lung, but I'm also taking care of the brain. Why again target volume? What are the other benefits? Yes, you have less variability of tidal volume. That means over a period of time, you have a reasonably stable tidal volume. You don't have a tidal volume which is going up and down at its whims and fancies. More stable carbon dioxides and decreased risk of brain injury. And other important is the other extreme. You are very scared to go up on the pressures and you have kept very low pressures. There is a low tidal volume. This also adds to lung injury in the form of atelectic trauma and hypercarbia. Do we have enough evidence for this? The evidence is in the form of a Cochrane, which was again updated in 2017, volume targeted versus pressure limited ventilation neonates, which is Klegenberg group. And I think they have beautifully said that the composite outcome of death or BPD was very much less with Thorgum. There were about 20 trials, and basically I think 8 to 12 trials were the one which had a major the impact on these studies, or the major weighted was there in about 8 to 12 studies, and they did find that it does reduce a composite outcome of death bar BPD. What are the other secondary outcomes they looked at? They said that this tidal volume resulted in reduction of rates of pneumothorax. It did reduce the mean days of mechanical ventilation, reduce the rate of hypocarbia, which is very, very important when it comes to brain injury. Rate of grade 3, grade 4 intraventricular hemorrhage. You can see the number needed to treat. There are about 15, there are about 11, there are about 20. And the combined outcome of periventricular leukomalacia with or without grade 3, grade 4 intraventricular hemorrhage, which is again significantly reduced when you have volume targeted ventilation. So in a nutshell, the meta-analysis has clearly proven, based on the 20 studies that were taken into account, that it does a beautiful job to reduce the death bar PPD. It does reduce pneumothorax. It does reduce IVH. It does reduce perivernical leukomalacia. So I do not think there is any doubt about the evidence that we have for it. Are we using enough volume targeted in the NICUs? I didn't get much of a data from our country, how many units are actually using it. But if you look at it, United States, there were only 40% in United States were using volume targeted, whereas it was much higher in Canada. And one of the major barriers they were found is knowledge about volume target and lack of appropriate equipment were the major two reasons they did find out. But I'm sure in our country also the percentage might be very, very high. Unfortunately, I didn't have any data to say what was the percentage of people who are using volume targeted in our NIC. So let's say, what are the barriers? Why are we not switching on and the evidence looks so good? And why are we not jumping on to saying, yes, let's use the volume targeted ventilation? I think the major limitation is the inertia or the fear of unknown. We have not used this mode. I'm very comfortable. My professor had taught me SIMB mode, and I'm very comfortable doing a pressure limited and time cycle. I'm not very comfortable using any new modes. That fear of unknown is what is a major thing. Need for more evidence. People felt that, no, I don't think the evidence is very good. But now I don't think there is that doubt. I think there is ample evidence to say volume targeted work. Lack of suitable devices. There is possible that all the ventilators do not have the mode, and people may not be willing to buy, or the current existing devices may not have the best of the volume guaranteed modes. The last most important is lack of training. People may not have been trained how to use a volume guaranteed ventilation. These are the reasons why people feel maybe I may not be using volume guaranteed. Even it took for time for me to also to understand this and start using volume guaranteed ventilation in our unit. It was very recently that we switched on or we started using volume guaranteed ventilation. What is very, very important or essential for successful volume guaranteed ventilation is basically you need to have the right ventilator and the right training. Why I'm saying this right ventilator is the ventilator, the volume target ventilator that you are going to use should measure the expired tidal volume, not the inspired tidal volume. Because the inspired tidal volume, some of the earlier or some of the basic ventilators do volume targeting by measuring the inspired tidal volume, which does not take into account the leak compensation or the endotracheal tube leak that happens around the endotracheal tube. And if the leak is more, the tidal volume that you deliver to the baby might be very, very dismal than what you actually have said. So the ventilator should measure the expired tidal volume very much close to the flow sensor, and that should be taken into algorithm to come to calculate the further pressures. I think that is very, very important that you have the ventilator. So if you are planning to buy a volume target ventilation in your unit, please ask the manufacturer, is it measuring the expired tidal volume? Does it count for the leak compensation? Does he have a safety point wherever there is a sudden increase in the tidal volume? There should be safety measures, because let the child suddenly coughs. There could be a sudden very high tidal volume. Does the ventilator have a safety mechanism to handle it? So these are complexities which a good volume target ventilation will give you, but many of the basic ventilator may not. As I told you, this should measure an expired tidal volume. The ET leak should be less than 50% whenever you are measuring. Though even if you are taking expired tidal volume, we need to understand that the expiratory, the ET tube leak cannot be more than 50%. If it goes beyond 40 to 50%, even if expired tidal volume can be underrated. And the most important thing in our units is a continuously functional flow sensor. I see this many times in my unit and the units when I go across is the flow sensors are not working. Take it from me, flow sensor are the eyes of the ventilator. If the flow sensor is not working, the ventilator cannot see anything. The ventilator cannot see whether the baby is breathing or not. The ventilator cannot see how much the tidal volume the baby has got. So it's very, very important that most of our ventilators or most of our nurses are trained to ensure the flow sensors are working all the time, because this are all work. This works on a principle of microprocessors measuring the expired tidal volume, having some algorithm to calculate the subsequent pressures. If my flow sensors are not working, there is a cross mark all the time seen on the ventilator. None of my words, including SIMB, will not work. You'll be just giving basic IMB. This is something which I always talk in ventilation workshops to insist and tell people that even if you put on SIMB, if your flow sensor is not working, you're not giving SIMB, you're only giving IMB. And most important is adequate monitoring. You need to keep seeing what is happening to the pressures, what is happening to the volume. You need to monitor, record. It is good to be on volume guaranteed, and you can forget and say, oh, I put the baby on volume targeted and everything will be taken care by the machine. No, you need adequate monitoring. So I think these are some points which I felt we should ensure before we jump on to say, yes, I will start using volume guaranteed ventilation in my unit. Going to the practical aspects, I think you can start VG as soon as you initiate the ventilator. There's no need to wait for a day or two. You can start the moment you intubate, you want to decide, you can start on volume guaranteed ventilation. A small point about the tidal volume. If it's a bigger baby, more than 750 grammer, you can use a tidal volume of 4 to 5 ml. But remember, if it's a smaller baby, if your babies are smaller, your tidal volume actually goes up. In contrary to what we think, oh, smaller the baby, smaller the tidal volume. No, smaller the baby, more is the dead space and higher is the tidal volume. And if the baby is been more than 3 to 4 weeks old, there is a lot of tracheobronchomalacia. Actually, the dead space again increases. Your tidal volume may have to go up to 6 to 7 ml per kg. So you need to be very, very clear. There is no one size tidal volume for all the babies. You need to decide the tidal volume based on the size of the baby and the age of the baby. So this is very, very important practical point that you need to understand when you are doing volume targeting ventilation. You need to adjust the PIP limit about 15 to 20% above the working pressures. Assist control or pressure support ventilation is the best mode to use along with VG. VG with SIMV has not been found to be very great because there were more episodes of desaturations and the babies probably had required more, they were more tachypneic, they required more pressure. So people feel assist control or pressure support is a good mode to be combined with VG. So these are the primary modes. You add on VG to any of these primary modes. You need to set an inspiratory time like what you do normally around 0.25 to 0.3 is what we set. Oops.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir. I'm audible.
Hello. Sorry, I've just logged in. Hello.
Yes, sir. You can continue.
Yeah, sorry. Can you just load on the PPT from there? Sorry, there's some problem with my laptop. I just got switched off.
Yes, sir. We are on the practical aspects.
Yep. So you need to set a inspected time. You need to ensure that you have set your positive and expirated pressure like any other ventilator. It is very, very important to understand.
Excuse me, sir. 1 minute. Can you share your presentation, sir? Or you want us to share the?
I think can you just share it from there? Sorry. I'm extremely sorry. Extremely sorry. Just go to the last but one slide here. Go down, please. My apologies.
Okay, sir. You can continue.
Yep. So ventilator to choose adequate positive and expirated pressure also. So you need to set your inspire time, you need to set your flow, which most of time around 6 to 8 liters, it suffices. And the third important aspect is adequate PWP. Remember, if you do not recruit your alveoli, none of your ventilator modes will work. Forget about volume guarantee, even your basic SIMV or high frequency or none of them will work if I do not adequately recruit the alveoli or maintain adequate functional residual capacity. So in addition to choosing the volume guaranteed mode, what is important in this is to choose adequate tidal volume, to set a pressure limit, which is at least about 20-25% above the working pressure that you get to see once the baby is on ventilator. And most important is set adequate PWP, adequate flow, and adequate inspiratory time. I think this is the most important crux, that you need to have all the settings in place. Can you go to the next slide, please? Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah.
So once the baby is on volume guarantee, the beauty of volume guarantee ventilation is the weaning happens naturally with improvement in lung compliance. I think this is the main USP for this particular mode, that unlike a pressure limited ventilator, where you put the baby on mechanical ventilation, if you're given surfactant, if there's improvement in lung compliance, you start reducing the pressures. You have to do it manually. But here, the beauty of this is the weaning happens naturally. As the lung compliance improves, the tidal volume, the pressure needed by the baby comes down, the machine starts delivering less and less pressures with subsequent breaths. And over a period of time, the machine says that I don't need to give any pressure. The baby is beautifully generating the set tidal volume all by itself. That is the time when you say, yes, the baby doesn't need any pressure. I can get the baby off the ventilator. Now, this is the most beautiful thing about volume targeted or volume guarantee ventilation, where as the lung improves, the pressure automatically starts weaning. You don't have to be there to reduce the pressure with every improvement in the lung compliance. The same can also happen if for some reason the lung is getting bad, the pressure also gets on increasing. So there is a beautiful aspect of this volume guarantee is this, that the weaning happens naturally if everything goes well. Let's say it's a 28-weeker, you've given surfactant, next 24 hours, beautifully the pressure needed comes down. You just need to reduce the FiO2 and to some extent tidal volume at a change of 0.5 ml. You don't meddle around too much, but let's say you're on about 6 ml per kg, you can bring it down to about 3.5 to 4 ml. And you can bring down the FiO2. That is the only parameter, if at all you want to touch. Tidal volume also very marginally, you need to come down. Rest will be taken care by the machine. And that's the most beautiful aspect. So it is one of the very popular modes for weaning also. Having on volume guarantee has a, in addition to being very lung protective, does a beautiful job in weaning this baby off the ventilator. You can extubate once your pressures required by the baby is less than 7 to 8 centimeters, or your set tidal volumes are being achieved by the baby's own efforts, and the machine says, I have no job, I'm not doing anything, everything is done by the baby, your job is done, and you probably are ready to get the baby off the ventilator. So these are some of the very practical aspects. As I told you, it's I mean, with a limited time, I didn't want to go into the details about volume guarantee, but I've tried to touch upon the most important aspects. What is the evidence and what are the limitations, where we should be careful when we are using volume guarantee. Probably that was the gist of my talk. Next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. So I think the key messages are very, very clear. Volume target ventilation is an excellent lung protective strategy to reduce BPD. I think from morning we have been hearing speakers speaking about how do we prevent BPD, what can we do. I think one of the things that you can do in your unit to start reducing BPD or to start reducing your ventilator-induced or physician-induced lung injury is try to switch on to volume-targeted ventilation. There is a definite evidence of major clinical benefit of volume-targeted ventilation. There is no doubt, right from the lung to the brain, it does a beautiful job in reducing BPD, reducing death, reducing the IVH, reducing pedoventricular leukomalacia, which are all your major concerns when you are ventilating the babies. But again, a word of caution, a right machine, proper training and technique is a prerequisite. Why I'm saying this again and again is the same fate will happen the way it started with high frequency ventilator. When people started high frequency, people did not know how to use it. And the trials initially said, no, the high frequency ventilator did not work very well. This is what happens when you jump the bandwagon without getting the adequate training or information or right techniques to use it. Only when you have adequate training, you have the right machine, right technique, I think it does a beautiful job. You just pick up some ventilator which a company person comes and says, sir, my ventilator gives volume targeted. What it does, after it reaches adequate volume, it switches off the pressures, which is not ready. It just measures the inspirative volume, not very right things to do. So I think what is important is understand and know your machines very well before you can start using it. But I'm sure if you have a right machine, right training and technique, you will do a good job with volume guarantee and you will do a very good job to your babies too. Thank you. Last slide, please. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep. If audience has any
questions on this, I know I could not go in depth of volume guarantee, but this was a overview that I felt was the best I could cover in 20 minutes time.
Thank you, sir. Any questions from the audience? Okay, that's it, sir. No questions from the audience. I would request our chairperson to comment on this.
Thank you, sir, for the lucid talk, which was well supported by the scientific evidence and good take-home messages too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir.
We would request Dr. Amit to present the certificate. Sir. Thank you, sir. So we'll be closing the session for the today. We have annual general body meeting in Hall A starting from 5:30. I request all of you to move to have your coffee and then move to the annual general body meeting at 5:30. After that, we'll have a gala, a banquet dining at 7 p.m. Thank you.